We'll intervene whenever we decide it's in our national security interest to intervene. And if you don't like it, lump it.
The problem with America is not that we go around marauding around the world imposing ourselves. The problem with America in the last 10, 15 years since the end of the Cold War, really in the last 60 years, is that we've been too slow to get involved.
I don't know how many Iraqi civilians were killed, but I can assure you that the number is the absolute minimal that it's possible in modern warfare.
Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.
You know, that land over there is yours. You'll go back to it one day because your fight will prevail and you'll have your homes and your mosques back again because your cause is right and God is on your side.
Welcome to the Dark.
Welcome to another episode of The Darkened Hour. I'm your host, Adam Fitzgerald, and joining me today is my co-host, Richard Cox. Richard, good afternoon. How are you?
Good afternoon, Adam. Yeah, good, thank you.
Hey, we're with a very esteemed guest from the Hoover Institution, Cole Bunzel, who I've been following for quite some time. Hoover Institution from Stanford University. He's an historian and Arabist. He studies the history and contemporary affairs of the Islamic Middle East with a particular focus on violent Islamism and the Arabian Peninsula. He is also the editor of the blog Jihadica, which will be in the description, and has written widely on the ideology of Sunni jihadism. His current book project, which we're going to be talking about today, Wahhabism, the history of a militant Islamic movement, which draws on an array of very rare manuscripts and other primary sources in Arabic, which provides a new account of the history and doctrine of Wahhabism, which gave rise to groups like Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. Bunzel received his master's in international relations from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and his bachelor's and PhD in Near Eastern Studies from Princeton University. He has been a research fellow in Islamic law and civilization at the Yale Law School and is a non-resident fellow at the George Washington University Program on Extremism. Cole, many thank yous for joining us today.
Thanks for having me on.
Cole, this is your very first book, and it was a whopper to begin with. Why this book, and why now?
Well, the book comes out of my PhD dissertation at Princeton University, which I completed in 2018. And I was interested in Saudi Arabia and its history. I didn't know what I wanted to study really, but when you go into a PhD program and you're interested in the history of the Middle East, there are certain areas that receive a lot of attention that have been written about, widely by numerous scholars. So, example, Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, some to a lesser extent, North Africa, but Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states more generally have received quite little attention comparatively. So I became interested in that for that reason and started going to the kingdom on research trips. It was a very closed country still at the time, but it was beginning to open up to foreign academics. So that's kind of how I got interested in Saudi Arabia. But at the same time, I had a parallel interest in the Sunni jihadi movement, that the movement, of course, associated with Al-Qaeda and ISIS, but which goes back to at least the 1970s. And a lot of the ideologues, or as what they would call themselves, the scholars or the ulama, the sheikhs of this movement, some of whom I've met now, they draw extensively on the tradition of what we call in the West Wahhabism, which is the Islamic revivalist movement that emerges in what is today Saudi Arabia in the mid-18th century. And so because of that parallel interest and an interest in studying the history of Saudi Arabia, I gravitated toward the history and doctrine of Wahhabism, which another reason I became so interested and fascinated with it is because it had been not studied very much by, in particular, Islamicists. That is, scholars of Islam and Islamic thought and law and theology. But there's so many sources. There was so much to kind of go back over. There's some work that was, fairly good. Very helpful, foundational to the study of Wahhabism and Western scholarship, but a lot of work was also very, I think, misleading, misconceived, and fundamentally flawed. So I ended up writing kind of a comprehensive work about Wahhabism to at least from its origins, and particularly to the early 20th century, when you begin to see some slackening of its militant principles, which I'm sure we'll go into.
Sure. And, look, like I said before we started recording, was that, I tried to study the motivations of, say, the 9/11 hijackers, for example, and why they would do this and what drove them to do this. Was it about Islam, or was it about something else, political or apolitical? And when I heard the term Wahhabism, I reiterate your point about very few solid reading material regarding the history of it. This is the first book that I've come across, and I've read scholarly books by some of the best experts in the world, like Thomas Hedgehammer and Ann Sterenson, and others like Tor Hamming, your fellow colleagues, and I know about very little in the layman's terms regarding Wahhabism and the founder Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. And this is the first comprehensive text, and it was comprehensive. I think I'm being liberal here. It was very meticulous and well researched. It is heavily referenced, and it took me a while to basically go back and look at my notes and stuff. But let's go back to Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab in regards to how you wrote about him. And it seems fascinating to me that he's born in the settlement of Al-Uyana, born in 1703. Which is the leading town in Najd, a very key area of the Emirate Diriyah, which is later Saudi Arabia. And the family of al-Wahhab were from al-Musharraf, and it's the family were its leading scholars. The leading tradition in Najd at the time was, as you write it, Hambaliism. So I got two questions here. What is Hambaliism? And the family had practiced Hambaliism, which is directly in opposition of al-Wahhab's ideology that he wanted to implement, which was Wahhabism. What are the differences between the two?
Okay, so Hambalism, or the Hambali Madhab, is one of the four mainstream schools of Islamic law in Sunni Islam. So you have Shafi'ism, Hanafism, Malikism, and Hambalism. Hambalism was a minority school. It was followed really only in pockets of Syria and, to a lesser extent, Iraq. And where it was dominant, however, was in this area of Najd, which is a large plateau area in the center of the Arabian Peninsula. And it had been the scholars from Saudi Arabia believe that it had been the dominant madhab, or school of law, since approximately the 13th century. And why, we're not really sure. But that's where the kind of Hambali tradition existed. But what's important to understand is that when it comes to Wahhabism, many of some scholars of Islam in the West have asserted that Hambalism gave rise to Wahhabism because Hambalism was the strictest of the schools of law. That's not really true, because the fact is that Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab was opposed by a lot of his fellow Hambalis. In fact, almost all of the scholars, the religious scholars of his era, were Hambalis, and they opposed him. But there was a particular strain of theology within Hambalism that Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab appealed to. And that is a strain of thought associated with a man named Ibn Taymiyyah and his student Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah, who were 14th century Hambali scholars who lived in Syria, Damascus primarily. And those scholars had a very, very strict understanding of Tawheed, or God's oneness, sometimes translated as monotheism. They believed that a whole lot of the Muslim world was wayward, that it had fallen away from the faith because of innovative practices, particularly practices associated with shrine or grave rituals, appealing to the dead, etc. So Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, he seizes on that aspect of the Hambali tradition, and with that he begins a movement predicated on we could call it the Taymiyan version of Tawheed, or God's oneness. Did I answer the question?
Yeah, no, fine. No, thank you very much. Interestingly enough, al-Wahhab, as he was later in his formative years, would hold debates over the supplication of the dead and visiting the graves. And his belief was that that only Allah had validity to be worshipped alone. But you also mentioned in the book, which I had not known before. You mentioned that while in the town of Hambali, after the death of his father, who, by the way, was in the middle of these very tense arguments, alWahhab launched a predictory campaign against polytheism while calling on people to direct worship. His father and brother even censored his views. And did this lead to alWahhab to become more invested in his doctrine?
Yeah, so as you said, Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, he belonged to a distinguished scholarly family, many of the El Musharraf, as you rightly noted. And they contributed numerous Islamic scholars and judges, people who are kind of the legal authority in these various towns within Nejd. But Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab was something of a wayward son. And there are really only a lot of rumors that we read in the refutations of him, but he had a very complicated relationship with his father, who was the chief judge of a little town called Horeymila, where he was living at the time. This is in the 1730s until early 1740s. And so what seems to have happened is that his father held him in check. Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab had these ideas about polytheism and how everyone around him was, in fact, not really Muslim because they either participated in grave worship, as he understood it. This was kind of supplicating saints, appealing to the dead people considered holy men for favors, either in this world or in the afterlife. And for Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, this was shirk. This was polytheism. It was associating others in the worship of God. And that was a cardinal sin, and that excluded one from the faith. But he did not preach these ideas until his father died in 1741. And that's when he begins kind of preaching openly, writing epistles or rasail, these documents where he summarizes his ideas about tawheed and shirk, about monotheism and polytheism, calling on people to reject polytheism and to direct their worship to God alone, or else they will be condemned to hellfire. So quite a controversial statement for the upstart preacher.
And it didn't end there. As you noted also in the book, that one of his earliest critics was Hambali Muhammad ibn al-Falik, who suggested that he had contempt for Wahhab's false teachings. Just explain a little bit more about this.
That he had contempt, sorry.
He had contempt for Wahhab's teachings.
Oh, yeah. So as soon as Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab starts preaching and starts sending epistles to first nearby towns in Nejd, and increasingly these epistles reach places as far away as Basra in southern Iraq, and they go to the Hijaz, Mecca, and Medina in the west, even to Yemen farther south. As soon as he begins preaching publicly and sending epistles, he attracts a large number of critics. These are Muslim scholars themselves who are reading these works and saying, this guy is a fraud. He is not only a fraud, he's a very dangerous fraud. He's leading people astray, leading them to takfir, to declare others to be non-Muslims. Takfir, of course, we all know that word if we study jihadism today. But it's true. Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab was accusing other Muslims of being polytheists, which is to engage in takfir. So he was met with a vitriolic response. One of those critics was a man named Muhammad ibn al-Faliq that you mentioned, who was in the east of the Arabian Peninsula. And he ridiculed Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, basically called him an idiot, an imposter. He said that he was engaging in ijtihad, or using independent legal reasoning, a very loaded term. But Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, he charged ahead. He ignored the critics, and eventually he would win the day.
Interesting. Just a follow-up to that, which I found amusing, by the way, that you wrote. Al-Faliq actually challenged him to some religious instruction and questions in which Wahhab had to answer in 10 volumes, but al-Wahhab could not do so.
Yeah, he was sort of this, one-upmanship. If you're really such a great scholar, then answer me, these questions and do it in 10 volumes. Anyone who engages in ijtihad certainly can do that. But to be fair, Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, his view was that people like Ibn al-Faliq and a lot of his critics who were accusing him of ijtihad, of engaging in independent legal reasoning. They completely misunderstood what he was doing. He wasn't trying to say that he had, supreme knowledge of the Islamic legal tradition. What he was arguing was that Muslims had lost their way because of straying from core Islamic beliefs and practices that had been taught by the Prophet Muhammad. The most important thing, and if you read the Quran, it's extremely present theme, the turning away from the worship of idols, from worshiping anything apart from God. And Muhammad al-Wahhab believed, influenced by Ibn Taymiyyah, that his contemporaries were not directing worship to God alone, and that's all he was trying to say: to return to Islam as the Prophet taught it.
Key period happens here is that Wahhab is actually expelled from Al-Uyana and finds himself in the nearby town of Al-Diriyah, where he meets the ruler Muhammad ibn Saud in 1736. Now, the exact years you wrote in the book is disputed among scholars, but nevertheless, he gains unilateral support, and Ibn Saud begins to impose his authority over neighboring towns with al-Wahhab's teaching following them. It is here that the very first Saudi state is born, and thus the initial growth of Wahhabism as well, where this paradigm between Ibn Saud's military might and al-Wahhab's teachings and scholarship would form the very first Saudi state. And that is still current model today. Could you explain more about this period?
Yeah, so Muhammad al-Wahhab is something of he's a lightning rod, of course, because of the controversial nature of his beliefs. And he begins preaching in the town of Huraymala. He's soon he relocates to the more powerful town where he was born of Al-Uyayna, and he's preaching there for a couple of years. And he had the support of the town's ruler, but somebody else who had a lot of influence over him, and a ruler in the eastern Arabian Peninsula who thought Muhammad al-Wahhab's ideas were abominable. He put pressure on that ruler to either kill him or expel him. And so Muhammad al-Wahhab was expelled from that town, and he found refuge in the town of Ad-Diriyah. And this is in about 1744. We're not the histories aren't entirely clear about when the relocation happened. And it was there that he met Muhammad bin Saud, who had been the ruler of this little town. These are all little oasis towns. So Nejd is a big strip of desert, but there are pockets of oases where settled life grew up. And one of those towns, Ad-Diriyah, which was not the strongest, but it was one of the strongest towns. He welcomed Muhammad al-Wahhab. He embraced him. He said that we'll support you. We won't kick you out. We have one condition, and that is that you not leave us and abandon us for another town. And in the succeeding years, this agreement had been reached. In the succeeding years, the little petty emirate of Ad-Diriyah begins to expand. It begins to conquer its neighboring towns, and it does so in the name of the doctrine of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab. That is the doctrine of pure Tawheed and true Islam, waging jihad against them for the basis of expanding the ambit of the faith. And that's sort of the origin of the Saudi political enterprise. It's important to understand that it might seem like, okay, so there's another state being formed. But the reality is there hadn't been a strong state in this area of the Arabian Peninsula since the 11th century. Hundreds and hundreds of years had passed since a state building enterprise had taken root here. And the reason is that there is really little in the way of natural resources to sustain it. But because of the faith brought in the conviction of faith brought by Muhammad Abdul Wahhab and his followers, this area was able to cobble together a state building enterprise for the first time in a long, long time.
You state in chapter 3 of the book that al-Wahhab justified offensive jihad against the unbelievers and the polytheists, and he justifies it by quoting Quran 839, meaning fight there till there is no fitna. But al-Wahhab, as you mentioned, would gloss over fitna as shirk. First, what is fitna and shirk? And secondly, was this for the purpose of eliminating the polytheists from the Yemen Ad-Diriyah based on his own doctrinal views of jihad?
Yeah, so his view of expansionary jihad, they're basically, first of all, just to step back, And in the Islamic legal tradition, there are essentially two versions of jihad in the sense of armed struggle. One is defensive jihad, jihad against an invading enemy, and the other is what is known as jihad at-talab, or jihad of seeking out the enemy, which is often termed offensive jihad or missionary jihad in the Islamicist literature. And Muhammad Abdul Wahab, sticking to tradition, he believed in both. He began his mission. If you follow the histories of the movement that the movement produced, the early experience of the Saudi state was one of defensive jihad. They were actually being attacked. Mm-hmm. I'm not so sure that's true, but that's part of the kind of mythology of Wahhabi Saudi history. But moving forward in time, to about 10 years or so after the founding of the first Saudi state in around 1744, we notice that jihad begins to be justified in offensive terms. And one of the oft-quoted Quranic verses justifying that expansionary jihad is the one that you cited. It's fight them until there is no fitna. And the religion is, I think it's, and the religion is God's entirely. And a traditional understanding of fitna, not the exclusive understanding of fitna, according to Quranic exegesis, is shirk. Fitna can mean a whole lot of things. It can mean strife. It can mean temptation. But it was often glossed as shirk, meaning polytheism. So in essence, what the verse is saying then is fight them, that is the unbelievers, until there is no polytheism and the religion is God's entirely. That's a very, kind of clean way of reading the verse. And according to Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahab, this was basically licensed to fight jihad against polytheists for the purpose of eliminating polytheism. That doesn't mean necessarily killing everyone who adheres to polytheism, but it does mean eliminating polytheism by converting people to the proper faith.
Let's go back to expansion for a little bit here, how the Saudi state expands, but it's also relating to a current period. As you highlight in the book, when a town's conversion to Wahhabism is made, a Wahhabi preacher actually is invited to instruct the Wahhabi doctrine and implement Islamic law, Sharia. One must also swear loyalty, bayat, and it's something I'm a little bit familiar with because this is similar to how al-Qaeda is operated. When it used to operate, those who are officially accepted swear, the first thing to do is swear loyalty to bin Laden first. Was this a prerequisite for Wahhab that they would to swear loyalty to him first, or to swear to God first?
Well, bay'ah in Arabic, which means it's kind of a covenant or an agreement between ruler and ruled, often translated as pledge of allegiance. According to the early Wahhabi histories, when a town was conquered, the people of that town had to swear bay'ah, had to swear loyalty to both the ruler, Muhammad ibn Saud, and the preacher, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahab. So these were kind of presented as co-leaders of the Saudi Wahhabi political enterprise. This is not this is an aberration really from the theory of bay'ah, the theory of rulership in Islamic law, which says that you're supposed to give bay'ah to the ruler, often termed the imam or the caliph. But what you see in the subsequent development of the Saudi state is that the role of the sheikh, especially after he dies in 1792, there is just one ruler, and it's very much a Saudi ruler, member of the Saudi family, and he acts as the imam, the supreme leader of this state, which is modeled after the early Islamic state in their understanding.
Al-Wahhab was alleged to have his followers perform Hijra to the territories under Wahhabism, which created the Eminent Dunya, the first Saudi state. Can you explain what Hijra is to our audience?
Yeah, Hijra, which is often translated as emigration, means the emigration from, traditionally is understood this way, emigration from the land of unbelief to the land of belief, from the land of kufr, unbelief, to the land of Islam. a place where the laws of Islam are applied, where they are being upheld, where there is a Muslim ruler, and it's a duty, according to the Quran and Islamic law, for Muslims to leave from a territory that is dominated by unbelief to a territory that is not dominated by unbelief, unless there is ikrah, unless the one is basically unable to do so because of oppression or something like that. That's the traditional concept. But it was very controversial in Wahhabism, and this was a theme particularly among Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab's critics, that he was urging followers to undertake hijra to the nascent Saudi state on the grounds that this was the only place where Islamic rule existed. And therefore, if you wanted to be a good Muslim, you had to relocate. Now, that's a very prominent theme in the refutational literature. It's not that prominent in the early Wahhabi literature, the writings of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab. He mentions it, but it doesn't come across to me as a historian as one of his central preoccupations. He seems to have been much more interested in expanding the domain of the Saudi state rather than urging anyone who agreed with him to relocate.
Another thing I learned from the book actually is that the Wahhabis were not a people adhering to non-canonical taxes or muqlas or tributes, kidwa, to financially support themselves. But they did partake in war spoils from their successful conquests and expansionism, the Saudi kingdom. Can you elaborate more on this? Because I find this to be, interestingly enough, that most of their finances came from the conquering of other towns, which is, how many towns are there to conquer?
Well, actually, it took a long time for them to conquer. It took some 20 years for them to conquer their immediate environment because of the political, the fractious political nature of that area. Sorry, what was the question? The question is about tribute.
How did they get by just on conquering towns for their to financially support themselves?
Well, it was a conquest state. It wasn't a state where you could tax your residents because they were engaging in considerable lucrative trade with the outside world. Quite to the contrary, Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab and his followers prohibited trade with lands considered to be lands of unbelief. So that was off the table. But following the model of the early Islamic State, this is their vision of how things were proceeding. They were setting out to conquer and seize the wealth of neighboring towns. They were going so far by the turn of the 19th century, so the late 1700s, early 1800s, they were beginning to conquer as far north as Iraq and Syria. They took the Hijaz in the west in the 1790s. They took the rich area to the east, al-Ahsa, sometime before that. And so, they were able to bring together a very wealthy state, and a lot of wealth was flowing into the capital of Diriyah.
Al-Wahhab dies in 1792, and the new Saudi ruler is Abdulaziz bin Muhammad al Saud, the eldest son of Muhammad ibn Saud and the son-in-law of Ibn Abdul Wahhab. It is through this new transition that the roles of the state and the Wahhabi creed was clear more than even its previous successor. Can you tell us more about this transition in this period?
Yeah, so the way I write about it in the book is that until the death of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, there was some ambiguity as to who held actual authority within the state. This is at least according to the earliest Wahhabi history that we have, which was written in the 1790s. And according to that history, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab and Muhammad bin Saud functioned more or less as co-rulers. They were both given bay'ah, the oath of allegiance. There are many episodes in which Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab is seen making political decisions, giving orders. But when he dies in 1792, there's really it's a new era, because the ruler is it Saud at that time? I think it's Abdulaziz still. The ruler Abdulaziz, he begins to function as the ultimate authority in the state. It's now a Saudi-dominated state. The El Saud are its rulers. The scholars, the Wahhabi sheikhs, they continue to exercise great influence in their teachers, their instructors. They are masters of the law. They are in charge of carrying out and implementing the Sharia, Islamic law, but they are subordinate, you could say, to the political authority. But the political authority, it needs to be understood here. It's not like the relationship that we've seen in the 20th century between the Saudi rulers and the Wahhabi scholars, the preachers, because at least according to all the historical evidence that we have at our disposal, the Saudi rulers in the 18th and early 19th centuries were deeply committed to the Wahhabi creed. They were just as committed to it as the Wahhabi preachers, and they were fighting jihad, expansionary jihad, believing that they were going to convert these polytheist lands to their north and west and east and south.
Abdul Aziz, he has a huge influence in how the third Saudi state grew after the beginning of the 20th century by growing the borders and keeping the scholars content, even though they criticized Abdul Aziz in doing so. How was he able to gain favor with them?
Yeah, so we're jumping quite far ahead now. So from the the 18th, 19th centuries to the early 20th century. So just to back up, the first Saudi state is destroyed in 1818 by an invading Egyptian army. There is a second Saudi state that exists for some 50, 60 years in the 19th century, but that is torn apart in a civil war. And in 1902, another member, a new young member of the Saudi family, Abdul Aziz ibn Abdul Rahman al Saud, he seizes the town of Riyadh in Najd and begins what is known as the third Saudi state. And the third Saudi state, which is the modern Saudi state as we have it today, it cobbles together the ancestral territory of the first Saudi state. It's very and it does so in collaboration with the Wahhabi scholars who are fighting or who are advocating and justifying the military efforts of Abdul Aziz as jihad against infidels, unbelievers. So just on the same model as the early Saudi state. But you asked about how he managed to kind of keep the scholars under his control, even as he kind of made moves politically that they disagreed with. Am I
that's right.
Understand you correct? Yeah. So, I mean, there were a lot of things that Abdul Aziz was, he was Wahhabi, but he was also very practical. And so he wasn't a fanatical adherent to the Wahhabi doctrine by any means. But he understood that his society adhered to this doctrine, that these scholars had prominent place in the society and in the political system even. But when it came to agreements with the British, there were sometimes that it seems like the scholars weren't even aware of what was going on. So Abdul Aziz got a subsidy from the British. Now the British are condemned as unbelievers, and there should be no collaboration with unbelievers. No inkling of loyalty to them. That is seen as something that expels one from the faith. So in some cases, the scholars were not quite aware, I think, of what was going on. But in other cases, they just kind of succumbed to reality. There have been a long period of time in Wahhabi history without a central authority, with rulers much worse in their view than the King Abdul Aziz, who did not agree with Wahhabism at all. So what happened is that King Abdul Aziz was able through, it's not entirely clear how his personality, his force of his will, his influence over these scholars to kind of agree to allow him to create a modern state and the international state system that was not going to be a jihadi conquest state, and to just kind of submit. And they invoked a lot of traditional statements from the Prophet about obeying one's leader. There was also a radical movement known as the Ikhwan, which was rebelling against Abdul Aziz at this time on the basis, partly at least, of strict militant Wahhabism. And the scholars well, they were not being obeyed by this group either. So they kind of found themselves caught between these crazy radicals and this modernizing king who was at least paying lip service to the ideals of Wahhabism, and they chose Abdulaziz. And Abdulaziz also gave them a whole lot of authority when it came to regulating the educational system, the religious institutions, etc.
I have to apologize for the jump in time because that was one of my last questions. Richard, do you have any follow-up questions for him?
Well, my questions are quite basic by comparison. But one of the things when I've read about Wahhabism, I wondered how it compares, and if it could be compared to any movement within Christianity. So what jumps to my mind would be Puritanism. And after the Puritans took power in England after the Civil War and were doing things like banning Christmas and wanting to get back to this purity of the faith and engaging in quite brutal practices like the execution of unmarried mothers, for example. So does that comparison to any kind of form of Christianity hold up, or does it break down in parts?
Yeah, well, I'm no expert in Christian theology, so I can't really assess the accuracy of any such comparisons. But what I can say is that a lot of the early Europeans who encountered Wahhabism as early as the 18th century, they interpreted Wahhabism as a kind of Puritan movement. And for that reason, in fact, they were very sympathetic to it. They thought, oh, he's trying to, this preacher, Muhammad Abdul Wahab, he's trying to remove all of the accretions and the false things that have built up in the religion over time and bring it back to its core, its pure core. And they saw that as a noble enterprise. So I'm sure there is a lot to these analogies. I think that a good Wahhabi would say that they're, of course, completely false analogies because the Christians were Trinitarians and they believed in three-headed God, and that's mistaken. So I think that the kind of maybe the austerity of Wahhabism, the idea that there are no images to be shown whatsoever, makes it different. There is the thing that comes to my mind though that of an accurate, possibly accurate comparison is the idea of saint worship. Luther and other Puritan reformers, Protestant reformers were deeply against the institution of saints, the idea that you would pay someone for certain favors in the afterlife. So there are parallels there between Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahab, who was also trying to go after saint worship, and including the idea that in Muhammad Abdul Wahab's case, there were examples where he was accusing people of taking money for guarding these shrines, things like that. So yeah, there's certainly an article, perhaps even a dissertation to be written on that subject.
Right. Well, what a figure like Sayyid Qutb, where would he sit in relation to Wahhabism? Because certainly, Adam, when we did the series on 9/11, we looked at the writings of Qutb as being underpinning the kind of revolutionary movements in Algeria and the more abortive one in Egypt. So what would his proximity be, or that kind of thing? Or indeed, to expand that a little, would there be any, this is a bit like my Puritan question, but would there be any comparison between like the Iranian Revolution and the doctrines of the Ayatollah then? And could that be considered a kind of Shia form of Wahhabism? Or again, does that break down? Does that comparison break down at some point?
Yeah, no, there's a great deal of overlap between Sayyid Qutb's thought and Wahhabism. I don't believe that Sayyid Qutb was influenced by Wahhabism. He was influenced to some degree by Ibn Taymiyyah, who had influenced the founder of Wahhabism. But even then, I'm not sure that really gave rise to Muhammad, to Sayyid Qutb's ideas, which were influenced, of course, by Maududi in Pakistan, India. So Qutb's idea was that because of a failure to implement Islamic law, to observe what he called, and some people before him, Hakimiyya, the sovereignty of God in the political legal domain, that Islamic society had reverted to one of Jahiliyyah, or pre-Islamic paganism. And you do find hints of this in Wahhabism. Ibn Abdul Wahab and his followers occasionally refer to their contemporary scene as one of Jahiliyyah. So that's an accurate comparison right there. but Muhammad Ibn Abdul Wahab, his primary, let's say, preoccupation was eliminating and persecuting saint worship, what he believed to be saint worship. So what's it called? Hagiolatry, if we want to use a fancy term. And that was what he wanted to get rid of. He didn't, the idea that there was emphasis on applying and implementing Islamic law, and there was some degree of grievance in his writing about the failure to apply Islamic law. But this was an era where there were no legal codes, there was no European legal political system being introduced, not in Central Arabia, at least at this point in time. So he was not kind of doing any kind of activism opposed to the failure to apply Islamic law. That was Sayyid Qutb's project. But there is a degree of overlap, because what they're both saying is that you're not giving worship entirely to God unless you do what I say. In Qutb's case, it was unless you give rule to God alone. In Muhammad Abdul Wahhab's case, it was unless you direct worship to God alone, in the sense of leaving off idols. But they both considered what they were attacking to be a kind of idol worship, and they accused broad sections of society, at least on the face of their writings, of having reverted to kufr, to unbelief. So, and over time, and I can continue to go into this, these concepts merge. And some of the ideas of Sayyid Qutb are kind of grafted onto Wahhabi theology in such a way that they become mainstream. In Sunni jihadism today, for example, the scholars of the movement, such as Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi, they tend not to reference Sayyid Qutb very much. Qutb had some problems in his theology that aren't consistent with Wahhabism, and they agree more with Wahhabism as being sound creed. But they're very much influenced by the idea of Hakimiyya that was introduced by Sayyid Qutb, and they've just kind of grafted it onto Muhammad Abdul Wahhab's conception of Tawheed.
Okay. One of the things, a comment I heard you made in an interview, actually, or a presentation, was that Wahhabism was hostile to democracy. Well, that's not necessarily shocking to me. A lot of people are hostile to democracy, but the reason being they saw it as a form of polytheism. And I didn't quite understand that particularly theological critique of democracy, that it was a kind of rival god almost. What exactly are they saying there? And then beyond that, if democratic government is out, does Wahhabism have something akin to a divine right of kings, that you can somehow theologically select a ruler or determine policy?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say that Wahhabism writ large is opposed to democracy. A whole lot of, you could say, radical actors have made a big deal about democracy being a version of polytheism, and in doing so, they have drawn on Wahhabi or Salafi theology, including some of the leading lights of the Sunni jihadi movement, such as Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi. One of his books is titled Democracy, a Religion. And the reason why for them it's a religion, it's a version of polytheism, is because according to Wahhabi theology, you are required to direct all worship to God alone. And that includes adhering to his laws alone. But God, in this understanding of the religion, is the sole legislator. He is a sharia, the one who makes law. No one else can make law. So if you allow another human being to make law, that means that you are setting him up as a god, and essentially you are worshiping him. So that's the idea that they are presenting, that people who are legislators, and usually it's kind of argued in terms of legislation, not so much as who is as executive authority. It's about legislation. So parliament is a big term in these diatribes. People who make laws, who serve as legislators, even if they're trying just to capture what's in the Quran, in the legal tradition, they're actually making laws, human man-made laws, and in doing so, serving as kinds of idols. Did that make sense?
Yeah.
One of my final questions for you, Cole, is this. With the now with the war on terrorism nearly finished and the decline of Al-Qaeda and groups like Boko Haram and Abu Sayyaf are declining all around Southeast Asia, Africa. How prominent is Wahhabism today in the kingdom? And do you see a rise in Islamist groups in the future?
Very good question. And just to back up as I routinely am doing. So in the early 20th century, you still had this militant version of Wahhabism that I was explaining, some 30 minutes ago. That was still the kind of dominant version of Wahhabism. But over time, in the 20th century, because of the influence of King Abdulaziz and his successors, the Wahhabi clerical class, the scholarly class, they adopt something of a more moderate version of Wahhabism. It's a version of Wahhabism that it doesn't let go of any of its creedal tenets. Everything is still the same in theory, but they approach the greater Islamic world as actually Islamic. It's no longer us, the true Muslims, and everyone else, the polytheists. That's no longer the conception of it. So they've kind of come to some sort of an agreement with the greater outside world. That version of Wahhabism was challenged by jihadis, of course, who argued, no, this is not the correct version of Wahhabism. But until very recently, this sort of moderate, still intolerant, but you could say moderate in terms of its activism and exclusivism version of Wahhabism was still sort of the enshrined version of the faith, according to the Saudi authorities. This has really been changing, however, under Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, becomes Crown Prince in 2017, after his father Salman is made king. And very recently, in fact, Mohammed bin Salman, or MBS as he's commonly known, he introduced a new holiday, which is called Founding Day, which is about rewriting the history of the first Saudi state, refounding it on a new date in a new year, that is 1727, before the beginning of Wahhabism, and thereby trying to make the argument that the Saudi state in its history was not actually wedded to Wahhabism. And he's made a lot of comments to the effect that Muhammad bin Abdul Wahab was just a preacher. He was one of many prominent people in the first Saudi state. And so he's really tried to undermine the legacy of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahab as a significant influence on the formation of the state. And I think that this is a big part of his effort to kind of reform the kingdom into something much more like the United Arab Emirates than it has traditionally been, which is kind of an Islamist almost state. There is, of course, still a great deal of Islamic opposition. A lot of it is now based outside of the kingdom. There's a very prominent preacher who I've been studying recently named Ahmed Sayyid, who is based in Turkey and has hundreds of thousands of followers on YouTube, who's doing a series of classes, online classes for free, trying to teach people to be good Muslims and ultimately, though he doesn't say this, oppose states like modern Saudi Arabia. So yes, the opposition continues. It still continues in a way that's influenced by militant Wahhabism founded in the 18th century, and we'll see who wins.
Cole, what projects are you working on today, and what's in the future for you?
So one project is to study this transformation under MBS and the holiday of Founding Day, its implications, the way that the kingdom is trying to rewrite its history, it's trying to move away both from the legacy of Wahhabism and the legacy of the Islamist movement of the later 20th century, which is known as the Sahwa. So that's one project. And then another project that I'm always working on is the history of and formation of the Sunni jihadi movement from the 1970s to the present.
Wahhabism, the History of a Militant Islamic Movement, is the name of the book. Cole Bunzel, the author, thank you very much for coming on today's show.
My pleasure.
Cool. Thank you.